Hello everyone. In the previous lectures, we were dealing with the theory of guṇa. In this lecture, we are going to deal with the opposite of guṇa, which is dosha or poetic faults. What is a dosha or a poetic fault? A dosha or a poetic fault is a blemish that a poet should never commit while composing a work of literature. In other words, if there are qualities that enhance the beauty of a literary work, there should be contrarian aspects that affect it adversely. These are called doshas or flaws that have to be avoided. In what is perhaps a departure from Western classical tradition, most of the Indian literary theorists, starting with Bharata, paid a lot of attention to this negative aspect of poetic creation. In other words, Sanskrit literary theoreticians believed in identifying pitfalls and warning the potential authors against them. Faults can occur in a literary work in many ways. Anything that adversely affects the meaning and hinders the proper enjoyment of the work can be counted as a fault. It can prevent, delay, or destroy the aesthetic appreciation. Like many other concepts that we saw earlier, the history of the concept of dosha can also be traced back to Bharata's Natya Shastra. Bharata defined the gunas as the absence of doshas. But we can see this basic definition undergoing a drastic change down the century. While Bharata considered dosha as the absence of gunas, many other theorists after Bharata enhanced the scope of the theory of dosha and incorporated many other elements that were not just the opposites of the gunas they were listing. An important turning point in the intellectual history of the idea of dosha is its relation with the notion of aujitya. We saw this idea briefly in our discussion of aujitya earlier. Now, we will see this concept in detail in our forthcoming lectures on doshas. Many later theorists maintained that the concept of dosha could not be determined outside the overarching domain of aujitya. It is also important to note that dosha is often contextual. For instance, double meaning bordering on obscenity can be seen as a guṇa in the language of Falstaff because it is really appropriate in a character like him. Thus, a precise definition of what is merit or a flaw is a problem. They appear to be contextual and contingent on the character who is being represented on the stage. Keeping this idea in mind, many later literary theoreticians came up with a new category called Vaisheshika gunas. Literary theoreticians as early as Bhamaha have spoken about this special character of dosha. Bhamaha's discussion in this respect happens in chapter 4 of his Kavya Alankara, where he discusses the Kavya dosha called Punarukti. Punarukti or tautology is the saying of the same thing over and over again in different words. Considering the fact that it results in boredom, creative writers and literary theoreticians unanimously opine that Punarukti is a dosha and it should be completely avoided from the remit of poetry. But Bhamaha points out that although Punarukti is usually considered a dosha or poetic fault, it is very much acceptable in the representation of emotions such as fear, jealousy, etc. Dandin also holds the same view. In the 4th chapter of his Kavyadarsha, Dandin says that apartha or incoherent argument is generally considered a poetic fault, but it becomes a guṇa or poetic merit in portraying the raving of a madman or a child's prattle or the speech of a person who is sick. Similarly, Dandin shows the Vyabhichara or exception to all these doshas. He is fully aware that in the realm of poetry, a certain thing is not a dosha by its very nature. Rudrada even goes to the extent of saying that almost all kinds of poetic flows become poetic merits when occasions demand the imitation of these flows. While representing the character of a mentally deranged person, the use of nonsense becomes inevitable. Namasadhu, the commentator of Rudrada's Kavyalankara, explains this point further. He says that when one portrays a character who is not good at speaking, all the poetic folds turn out to be poetic merits. To explain his point further, he cites the instance of the funny description of the illiterate husband of the poetess Vikata Nidamba, who is unable to pronounce words properly. Anandavarthana also holds the idea that anaujitya or impropriety is anitya or impermanent. For example, Anandavarthana opines that the dosha called shruti dushta or the employment of harsh words will become a guṇa in the case of emotions like raudra rasa or the aesthetic emotion of rage. Bhoja calls these kind of doshas, that is doshas that can turn out to be gunas, dosha gunas or vaisheshika gunas. It is also important to note that what is considered a dosha today can turn out to be a guna later, and today's poetic merit can possibly turn out to be a dosha in the future. We will see this idea in detail later. In today's lecture, we are primarily going to see the idea of doshas as conceived by Bharata. Bharata mentions 10 doshas or poetic faults in his Natya Shastra. These 10 defects or doshas mentioned by Bharata include Gudartha, Arthandara, Arthahina, Bhinnartha, Ekartha, Abhiplutartha, Nyayapeda, Vishama, Visanti and Shabdachyuta. Let's take a look at these doshas in detail. The first defect that we are going to take a look at is Gudartha. What is a Gudartha? Gudartha is the employment of an uncommon word or a roundabout way to describe a common idea. Bharata opines that periphrastic or circumlocutory words often baffle the readers and delay the process of enjoyment or aesthetic appreciation. The next dosha is Arthandara. Arthandara is an unnecessary description. The next poetic fault is Arthahina. Arthahina is the use of absurd words. After Arthahina, Bharata goes on to describe the poetic fault Bhinnartha. Bhinnartha that Bharata mentions is very much related to the idea of social propriety or aujitya. According to Bharata, Bhinnartha is the use of obscene and crude words. According to Bharata, Bhinnartha has got a variety. Bharata is of the view that if what is stated by the speaker generates a new meaning that is not intended by the speaker, then also the dosha called Bhinnartha will arise. The fifth dosha mentioned by Bharata is Ekartha. What is Ekartha? Ekartha is punarupti or tautology. In other words, it is the repetition of the same word or idea over and over again. The next defect that Bharata lists is Abhiplutartha. If there is no connection between words or phrases in a sentence, then it will result in a dosha called Abhiplutartha. The next dosha is called Nyayapeda. Nyayapeda is the use of statements that go against the well-known facts about places, time, etc. If one makes a statement that is against the facts codified in Shastras, that can also be considered a dosha called Nyayapeda. The eighth dosha that Bharata talks about is Vishama. Vishama occurs in poetry when poetical meters are mixed up. The next dosha that Bharata elaborates on is Visanti. Visanti occurs when syllables or words that cannot be joined together are put adjacent to each other. Finally, the last dosha is Shabdachyuda. Shabdachyuda is cacophony resulting from dissimilar sounds. Let's wrap up the class by seeing all these doshas in a nutshell. Gudartha is the employment of an uncommon word or a roundabout way to describe a common idea. Arthandara is an unnecessary description. The next poetic fault is Arthahina. Arthahina is the use of absurd words. Bhinnartha denotes the use of obscene and crude words. Bhinnartha has got a variety where if what is stated by the speaker generates a new meaning that is not intended originally by the speaker. Ekartha is punarukti or tautology. Abhiplutartha is the poetic fault resulting from the absence of connection between words or phrases in a sentence. Nyayapeda is the use of statements that go against the well-known facts and the statements codified in Shastras. Vishama occurs in poetry when poetical meters are mixed up. The dosha called Visanti occurs when syllables or words that cannot be joined together are juxtaposed against each other. Shabdachyuda is the cacophony resulting from the combination of dissimilar sounds. With this, I am concluding my first lecture on the concept of dosha. Soon, in the following lectures, we will see how the idea of dosha was conceptualized by later theoreticians like Bhamaha, Dandin, Vamana, Anandavarthana, and so on. I hope you have understood all these 10 doshas that I have described so far. Thank you.